The cold wind howled through the empty alley, and there, barely clinging to life, was a starving golden retriever mother with 5 tiny puppies curled up against her. Her frail body trembled, her golden fur soaked from the freezing rain. She had given everything to keep her babies alive, but now she had nothing left to give. When former cop David found them, he thought he was just rescuing an abandoned dog family. But as he gently lifted the mother into his arms, he noticed something odd. Her worn-out collar had a number, scratched out, as if someone wanted to erase her past. And that was just the beginning, because what David uncovered next would lead him down a dark and dangerous path, one that no one dared to investigate. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this incredible story. The rain had been falling for hours, an unrelenting downpour that turned the streets of Hollow Creek into a slick, glistening maze of water and shadow. The streetlights cast weak, flickering halos onto the pavement, struggling against the darkness. It was late, too late for anyone to be wandering these empty roads, but David Monroe wasn't just anyone. He drove slowly through the quiet streets, hands gripping the steering wheel of his old Ford truck. The rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers filled the cabin, a monotonous sound that matched the dull ache in his chest. He had taken to these late-night drives out of habit, a way to outrun the ghosts of his past. The town had changed over the years, but it was still small, still the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions. David himself had changed too. In his prime, he had been a formidable figure, broad-shouldered, strong, the kind of man who could command attention just by walking into a room. But years of working homicide had worn him down. Now, in his early 50s, his once powerful frame had softened, his dark brown hair streaked with gray at the temples. Lines creased his face, not just from age, but from memories he wished he could forget. After walking away from the force, he had settled into solitude, his only company the silence of his home and the occasional drink too many. It was supposed to be just another night, just another aimless drive through the rain. But fate had other plans. As he turned onto a side street near the old train yard, something caught his eye, a dark shape huddled against a brick wall in the alleyway. At first, he thought it was just trash, the kind that blew in from the neglected parts of town, but then it moved. David slowed the truck, narrowing his eyes. The dim glow from a nearby street lamp revealed more details. It was a dog, a large golden retriever, her fur matted and soaked from the rain. Her ribs jutted out from her thin frame, her body curled protectively around a small bundle. Not just one, 5. 5 tiny puppies, barely old enough to have opened their eyes, pressed against their mother's belly. They shivered violently, their fragile bodies curled into each other for warmth. David exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He should keep driving. It wasn't his problem. But then the mother dog lifted her head, and for a brief second, their eyes met. There was no aggression in her gaze, no fear, just exhaustion. A bone-deep weariness that mirrored his own. David hesitated before finally muttering a curse under his breath. Pulling over, he turned off the engine and stepped out. The moment the cold rain hit his skin, he winced. The chill cut through his jacket, but it was nothing compared to what the mother dog and her pups had been enduring. As he approached, he crouched down, getting a closer look. The mother didn't growl or snap. She simply watched him, too weak to move. Her golden fur, once thick and soft, was tangled with mud and grime. Her paws were raw, the pads cracked as if she had walked for miles on rough terrain. Despite her condition, she had curled her body around her puppies, shielding them from the worst of the storm. "Jesus," David muttered. Reaching out slowly, he placed a hand on her side. She flinched but didn't fight him. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling from both cold and exhaustion. The puppies barely stirred. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" His voice was low, almost gentle, something he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. One of the puppies let out a tiny whimper, so soft it was almost lost in the rain. That sound did something to him, something he couldn't quite explain. He needed to get them out of here. Shrugging off his jacket, he carefully draped it over the mother dog before scooping her up. She barely had the strength to lift her head as he carried her toward the truck. Her weight was almost nothing, too light for a dog her size. David opened the passenger door and placed her on the seat, bundling the jacket around her to keep her warm. Then, one by one, he picked up the puppies, tucking them into the folds of the fabric. Back in the driver's seat, he turned up the heat, letting the warm air wash over them. The mother let out a low, barely audible sigh, her body finally relaxing. It was only then that David noticed something unusual. Beneath the wet, tangled fur of her neck, there was a scar. A thin, pale line encircling her throat like a cruel reminder of something terrible. His jaw clenched. He knew that kind of mark. That wasn't just from a collar. That was from being chained. For a long time, he reached toward her cautiously, brushing the fur aside. His fingers traced the outline of the scar, and as he did, something caught the dim glow of the dashboard lights. A metal tag. It was attached to an old, frayed collar, nearly hidden beneath the mess of her fur. But what made his stomach twist was that the tag had been scratched out, as if someone had deliberately erased whatever name or number had once been there. David exhaled slowly, his mind working through the implications. Someone had owned this dog, and whoever they were, they hadn't just abandoned her. They had wanted to make sure no one could trace her back to them. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't just neglect. This was something worse. He glanced at the mother dog again. Despite everything, she was still awake, her dark eyes locked onto him. There was no pleading in her gaze, no desperation, just a quiet, patient kind of acceptance. She had suffered, but she had survived. And now, David had a choice to make. He could drop them off at the nearest shelter, let someone else handle it. That was the easiest thing to do. Or he could find out where she had come from, who had done this, and why. The rain continued to pour outside, drumming against the roof of the truck, but David no longer noticed. Because for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something he thought he had lost. Purpose. He put the truck into gear and drove. The rain had eased by the time David pulled into his driveway, but the cold still clung to the air. His house sat at the edge of Hollow Creek, a modest structure that had once been a home, but now felt more like a shelter, functional, quiet, and just barely holding together. He parked the truck, shut off the engine, and glanced at the passenger seat. The mother dog still lay curled in his jacket, her breathing slow but steady. The puppies, nestled in the folds of fabric, had finally stopped shivering. David exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. He had dealt with plenty of cases involving abandoned animals before, but something about this one felt different. The scar around the dog's neck, the scratched-out tag. It wasn't just neglect. Someone had erased her past on purpose. Lifting the mother dog carefully, he carried her inside, balancing the puppies in one arm. His living room was sparse, an old couch, a bookshelf gathering dust, a coffee table with too many coffee rings. He set them down on a pile of blankets near the fireplace and turned on the heat. The mother barely moved, only flicking her eyes toward him in silent trust. He crouched beside her, gently running his fingers over the metal tag again. The number had been scratched out, but the engraving was deep, and he could still make out faint impressions. He knew someone who might be able to help. David grabbed his coat and his truck keys again. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for favors often, but if there was anyone in town who could make sense of this, it was Sarah Whitmore, the local vet. Sarah had been a staple in Hollow Creek for over 20 years. In her late 40s, she was the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She was tall and lean, with sharp green eyes that missed nothing, and auburn hair that she kept tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Most people found her blunt, almost curt, but David knew better. She wasn't cold, just practical. She had once been a field veterinarian for a national rescue organization, traveling across disaster zones, treating animals in the aftermath of hurricanes, floods, and fires. That kind of work changed a person. It made them hard in some ways, softer in others. When she had finally settled in Hollow Creek, she had brought that same relentless determination with her. David had worked with her before, years ago, on a case involving an illegal dogfighting ring just outside of town. It had been one of the few cases he had seen through to the end, one of the few where justice had actually been served. Sarah had been instrumental in gathering medical evidence, documenting injuries, proving that the dogs had been abused. After that, she had earned his respect. By the time he arrived at Whitmore Veterinary Clinic, the neon open sign was still glowing in the front window. Sarah's place was small but efficient, a single-story brick building with a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and coffee. David pushed open the door, the familiar chime ringing overhead. Inside, Sarah stood behind the counter, flipping through a file. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Well, if it isn't David Monroe," she said, setting the file aside. "I thought you had retired from playing hero." David huffed. Didn't realize picking up a stray counted as hero work. Sarah arched an eyebrow. "Depends on the stray." Without another word, David stepped aside, revealing the mother dog in his arms. Sarah's sharp gaze softened. Just a little. She was no stranger to cases like this, but even she looked grim as she took in the dog's condition. "She's in bad shape," Sarah murmured, stepping closer. "How long has she been like this?" "No idea," David admitted. "Found her in an alley with 5 pups. No food, no shelter. She's been hanging on, but I don't know for how much longer." Sarah sighed, already moving to grab her stethoscope. "Put her on the table. Let's take a look." David did as she asked, carefully placing the dog on the exam table. Sarah moved quickly but gently, running practiced hands over the mother's thin frame, checking her pulse, inspecting her paws. She muttered something under her breath about dehydration and malnutrition. Then she reached for the metal tag on the collar. Her fingers brushed over the scratched-out engraving, and she frowned. "That's deliberate," she said. "Someone didn't just lose this dog. They wanted to erase her." David nodded. "That's what I thought." Sarah grabbed a microchip scanner from a nearby drawer. "Let's see if she's chipped. Maybe we can get an ID." She ran the scanner over the dog's neck, waiting for the telltale beep. Seconds passed. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. Sarah frowned, shaking the scanner slightly. "It's working," she muttered, scanning her own arm for confirmation. The machine beeped normally. David felt a chill creep up his spine. "What does that mean?" Sarah's gaze met his, her expression serious. "It means someone removed the microchip." David exhaled sharply, stepping back. Microchips weren't easily removed. They were implanted beneath the skin, meant to last for the lifetime of an animal. If hers was gone, it meant someone had surgically taken it out. Someone had wanted this dog untraceable. "This isn't just some backyard neglect case," Sarah said, setting the scanner down. "You know that, right?" David's jaw tightened. "Yeah." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "You think this ties into something bigger?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but it reminds me of something." Sarah crossed her arms. "Let me guess, the old dogfighting case?" David nodded. That case had never sat right with him. They had shut down one operation, sure, but it had felt too easy. The suspects had taken a plea deal, and the higher-ups had brushed off the idea of a larger network. But now, years later, here was a dog that had clearly been erased from existence. Sarah sighed. "I hate to say it, but if someone went through the trouble of removing her chip and scratching out her tag, they didn't just dump her. They discarded her." Discarded. The word made David's stomach twist. He looked down at the mother dog, who still lay motionless on the table. She was barely hanging on, but despite everything, she had refused to leave her puppies behind. David had seen plenty of cruelty in his life. He had spent years chasing criminals, locking up people who hurt others without remorse. But something about this case felt different. It felt personal. He wasn't sure why, not yet. But he was going to find out. What do you think really happened to this mother dog before David found her? Why would someone go through so much effort to erase her past? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The morning sun barely cut through the thick clouds overhead as David drove toward the outskirts of town. The roads were still damp from last night's rain, glistening under the weak light. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, his mind replaying everything Sarah had said the night before. Someone had gone through the trouble of removing the dog's microchip, of erasing her identity. That kind of effort wasn't just negligence. It was intentional. As he drove past the last gas station on the edge of Hollow Creek, the landscape changed. Houses grew sparse, replaced by fields of overgrown grass and abandoned lots. He had spent enough years as a cop to know that these outskirts were where things were buried, both literally and figuratively. His destination was an old industrial lot, long forgotten by most of the town. Years ago, it had housed a storage facility, but it had been shut down when the owners went bankrupt. Since then, it had become a no-man's land, just another place where people dumped things they didn't want to be found. David pulled his truck to a stop near the rusted chain-link fence surrounding the property. The entrance was sealed with an old, heavy-duty padlock, but the side fencing had been cut open. a clear sign that someone had been through here recently. He stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel, and scanned the area. The place smelled of decay, damp earth, rusted metal, and something else, something foul. He took a slow breath, listening. Then he heard it, a faint whimper. He moved forward, stepping through the broken section of the fence. The ground was uneven, littered with old beer bottles and debris, but David's focus was on the rows of abandoned storage sheds. Most had their doors rusted shut, but a few had been forced open, their interiors dark and empty. The whimper came again. This time, he followed the sound toward one of the sheds at the far end of the lot. Its door hung slightly ajar, swinging in the breeze. David approached cautiously, pulling out the flashlight he always kept in his jacket. He pushed the door open, revealing a concrete floor stained with something dark. The air inside was thick with the stench of urine and fear. And in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a crate, a dog crate. He moved closer, his pulse quickening. The crate was too small, meant for a dog half the size of the one inside. A Labrador mix, maybe a year old, cowered against the back wall of the cage, its ribs visible beneath its dirty, matted fur. The dog flinched as David knelt down, its wide brown eyes locked onto him in fear. "Hey there, buddy," David murmured, keeping his voice low. "You alone?" The dog's ears flattened. It wasn't alone. A rustling sound came from behind him, just outside the shed. David stiffened. Then he heard footsteps. He turned sharply, but before he could react, a figure stepped into the doorway. The man was tall and wiry, wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. His stance was casual, almost relaxed, but David could tell this wasn't a random trespasser. The man tilted his head slightly. "You lost, old man?" His voice was smooth, too controlled. David remained where he was, one hand still resting on the dog crate. "Not at all," he replied evenly. "Just checking out some property." The man smirked. "Funny, because I don't remember seeing your name on the deed." David's eyes stayed locked on him. Years of experience told him this was not someone who was just here by accident. The man took a slow step closer, and David caught a glimpse of ink on his wrist, a jagged black tattoo, half hidden under his sleeve. A familiar tattoo. David had seen it before, years ago, back when he had taken down a dogfighting ring just outside Hollow Creek. David's chest tightened. He had always suspected there was more to that case, that they had only scratched the surface. And now, standing in front of him, was proof. The man gave him an easy smile. "How about you get back in your truck and drive away? You don't belong here." David didn't move. He had been in far too many standoffs to be intimidated by a smirk and a few threats. Then, he heard a second set of footsteps. He didn't have to turn around to know that another man had stepped behind him. Outnumbered. For a moment, David considered his options. He could take the fight, but there was no guarantee he'd win. He could play it cool and back off, come back later when he wasn't alone. Or he could try something riskier. "Fine," he said, raising his hand slightly. "I'll leave." The first man grinned. "Smart." David took a slow step back, moving toward the entrance. The second man, broader, heavier, shifted slightly, watching him like a guard dog waiting for a command. David gave him nothing. No sudden movements, no sign that he was taking mental notes of everything. Their build, their tattoos, the way their eyes darted toward the sheds, as if checking if something was still hidden inside. As soon as he was past the doorway, he turned toward his truck. Neither man followed, but they were watching. He felt their eyes on him as he slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled onto the road. It wasn't until he was back on the highway that he let out a slow breath. That place had not been abandoned, and those men weren't just squatters. They were protecting something. The question was, what? And why? David glanced at the rearview mirror, his grip on the wheel tightening. He was going to find out. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees as David pulled his truck into the dirt lot behind Whitmore Veterinary Clinic. The sun had barely set, but the sky was already fading into a deep navy blue. He killed the engine and checked his surroundings. The streets were empty, quiet, just how he wanted it. He had called Sarah earlier in the day, telling her what he had seen at the abandoned property. She hadn't hesitated. "I'll meet you at my clinic. Bring a flashlight," she had said, her voice steady, controlled. Now, as he stepped out of his truck, the back door of the clinic opened. Sarah emerged, dressed in dark jeans, a fitted jacket, and a gray beanie pulled over her auburn hair. In the dim light, the sharpness of her features stood out. High cheekbones, a firm jawline, and those ever-watchful green eyes. She wasn't just a vet. She was a woman who had spent years seeing the worst of what humans could do to animals, and it had hardened her. "You ready?" she asked, tossing him a small flashlight. David caught it and nodded. "Let's move." They drove separately, keeping a safe distance between their vehicles. The plan was simple. Get in, look for anything they missed, and get out before anyone noticed. But as David pulled up to the property again, a gnawing feeling settled in his chest. The place looked even more abandoned than before. The shed doors that had been ajar earlier were now completely shut. The footprints in the mud, the signs of recent activity, gone. Someone had been here since his last visit, and they had cleaned up fast. Sarah stepped out of her car, surveying the area. "Looks like they knew someone was snooping around." "Yeah," David muttered, "which means we have to be careful." They slipped through the cut fence, moving toward the sheds. The air was thicker than before, carrying a faint, acrid stench. David's gut twisted as he shone his flashlight over the ground. It wasn't just dirt, it was ash. Sarah crouched, rubbing the blackened earth between her fingers. "They burned something." Her voice was low, controlled, but he could hear the anger beneath it. David moved ahead, pushing open one of the shed doors. Inside, the air was stale, thick with decay. The walls were lined with rusted chains, and in the corner, an overturned metal cage, its bars bent inward as if something had struggled against them. "This was a holding area," Sarah murmured, stepping beside him. David's flashlight swept across the floor, illuminating deep scratch marks, the kind made by desperate claws. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just a hiding spot. It had been a prison. They moved to the next shed. This one had a heavy metal lock, but David kicked it open with ease. Inside, a set of old filing cabinets sat against the wall. Sarah immediately went for the nearest drawer, yanking it open. It was empty. She moved to the next. Empty again. David clenched his fists. "Damn it! They wiped everything." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she was staring at something on the ground, a pile of discarded collars, tangled together like a mass grave. She knelt down, picking through them, her breath catching as she pulled one free. It was worn, frayed at the edges, with a small rusted tag hanging from it. She turned it over, brushing away the dirt, and froze. David crouched beside her. "What is it?" She held it up to the light. The engraving was faded, but still visible. It was the same design as the collar the mother dog had been wearing. David felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "She was here." Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on the collar. "And she wasn't the only one." David's flashlight landed on a crumpled piece of paper wedged between the floorboards. He reached for it, unfolding it carefully, his stomach twisted. It was a list. Names, dozens of them. Each line had a breed, an age, and a handwritten checkmark next to certain ones. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "These are missing dogs." David scanned the page, and his blood ran cold when he spotted it. Golden Retriever, female, 4 years, marked as processed. He didn't know what processed meant, but he knew it wasn't good. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she exhaled. "This is proof, David." David folded the list and shoved it into his pocket. "Yeah, but proof of what exactly? A breeding operation? A fight ring? Something worse?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know, but we can't let this go." David stood, scanning the shed one last time. There was no doubt in his mind anymore. This wasn't just a place where animals had been dumped. This was a graveyard, and someone had gone through a lot of trouble to keep it hidden. David turned towards Sarah. "We need to figure out who's behind this, and fast." She met his gaze, nodding once. "Then let's get to work." The rain had finally stopped by the time David pulled up to Hollow Creek General Hospital. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet pavement and distant pine. He shut off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. His mind kept going back to that list of missing dogs and the scratched-out tag on the mother dog's collar. And now, after hours of digging through old reports, he had found a name. Ethan Carter. The boy had been 10 years old when his golden retriever was stolen. The case had been dismissed as just another lost pet, one of many in a town that had long since stopped caring. But now, with everything David had uncovered, it was clear. It hadn't been just a missing dog. And Ethan, now 15, might be the only person who could help him understand what had really happened. David stepped out of the truck and headed toward the hospital entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a low hum, and the scent of disinfectant filled his nose. He hated hospitals. Too many bad memories. A nurse at the reception desk glanced up at him. She was middle-aged, with short silver hair and tired eyes, the kind of woman who had seen too much suffering, but still greeted people with a patient smile. Her name tag read, Margaret Hill. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but guarded. "I'm here to see Ethan Carter," David said, keeping his tone even. "I used to be with the Hollow Creek PD. Just need to ask him a few questions." Margaret hesitated, glancing at the clipboard in front of her. "Ethan is still in recovery. He's been through a lot." "I know," David said. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." Margaret studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Room 214. But keep it short. The kid doesn't get many visitors." David nodded his thanks and made his way down the hall. The hospital was quiet at this hour, the kind of sterile silence that made every footstep sound too loud. When he reached 214, he hesitated before knocking lightly on the door. "Come in," a voice called, softer than he expected. David pushed the door open. The boy in the hospital bed was thin, too pale for his age, his blonde hair unkempt, and his blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion. His left leg was wrapped in a cast, propped up on pillows, and an IV line ran into his arm. He looked like a kid who had been through too much, too soon. Ethan blinked at David, confused. "Who are you?" David stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "My name's David Monroe. I was a cop here in Hollow Creek for a long time." Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "You're not a cop anymore." David smiled just a little. "Guess I lost my badge, but not my curiosity." He hesitated, then pulled a photo from his pocket, a blurry shot of the mother dog, taken just last night. He handed it to Ethan. The boy took the photo carefully. The second he saw it, his breath hitched. His fingers clenched around the edges. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Daisy." David sat in the chair beside the bed. "So, it's her?" Ethan nodded quickly, his eyes welling up with tears. "She was my best friend." His voice cracked. "I had her since I was 6. My parents got her for me after my first surgery." David frowned. "Surgery?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I was born with a bone disorder. My legs are weak, and I had to have a lot of procedures to help me walk properly. Daisy, she was always there. She'd sit next to me after surgeries. She'd sleep on my bed. His voice caught, and he wiped his face quickly. Then one day, she was just gone. David leaned forward. "Do you remember anything about that day? Anything strange?" Ethan swallowed hard. "It was late. My parents weren't home. I heard Daisy barking outside, so I went to check. She never barked like that. It wasn't like she was scared. It was like she was trying to warn me." David's gut tightened. "And then?" Ethan stared down at the photo, his hands trembling. "I ran out the back door, and I saw a man dragging her into a truck. She was fighting him, but he had something around her neck, some kind of chain. I yelled, but he didn't stop. He hit her." His voice cracked again. "And then he drove away." David exhaled slowly, his hands clenching into fists. "Did you see his face?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Not all of it, but I remember his arm. He had a tattoo. It was black, like jagged lines, kind of shaped like a dog's skull." David's blood went cold. He had seen that tattoo before, on the man who had confronted him at the abandoned lot. Ethan looked up, his expression dark with something that wasn't just sadness. It was recognition. "I saw him before." David frowned. "Before that night?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah." He hesitated, then said something that made David's stomach drop. "He was in the newspaper. After you arrested him." David's breath stalled. He had arrested a lot of people in his time, but only one man had been involved in dog-related crimes and walked free after a plea deal. Trevor Lane, the leader of the dog-fighting ring David had taken down years ago, the same man who should have been in prison. David's jaw clenched, His pulse thundered in his ears. Trevor had been the one to take Daisy, and now, somehow, he was back. David rose to his feet, his mind racing. He had let that man slip through the cracks once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. David sat behind the wheel of his truck, parked on the edge of a desolate dirt road just outside Hollow Creek. The night was eerily still, the only sound the occasional rustle of wind through the dry grass. He had spent the last 3 days tracking every lead he could find on Trevor Lane. The man Ethan had identified, the same man David had once arrested. And now, he knew exactly where to find him. A rundown property sat a quarter-mile ahead, barely visible in the moonlight. From what David had gathered, it had once been a junkyard, but in recent years, it had become something else, a hub for illegal animal trade. Reports of stolen pets, missing strays, and even rumors of a breeding mill had all led back here. He exhaled, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He had spent years upholding the law, believing in the system. But tonight, the system wasn't going to save those dogs. Tonight, he was on his own. A sharp knock on the passenger window made him turn. Sarah stood outside, her face set in determination. He unlocked the door, and she slid in, dressed in dark clothes, her auburn hair tucked under a black baseball cap. "You sure about this?" she asked, her green eyes scanning his face. David nodded. "If we wait any longer, those dogs are gone." Sarah exhaled. "Then let's do this." The warehouse. They moved through the overgrown lot, keeping to the shadows. A tall chain-link fence surrounded the junkyard, but years of neglect had left gaps in its defenses. David led the way, slipping through a break in the metal. Inside, a large warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior blending into the darkness. Faint voices carried through the air, along with the distant, unmistakable sound of dogs whining. David's jaw tightened. He motioned for Sarah to stay close as they crept toward the side of the building. Through a grimy window, they could see the operation in full swing. At least a dozen cages lined the floor, filled with dogs of all breeds. Some were purebreds, likely stolen for resale. Others were strays, thin and frightened, their ribs visible through their fur. And then there were the ones in the back, caged separately, larger, stronger, fighting dogs. Sarah inhaled sharply beside him. "This is worse than I thought." David didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Trevor Lane. He hadn't changed much. Mid-40s, tall, muscular, with a shaved head and that same jagged tattoo running down his forearm. He was standing near a metal table, counting cash, while 2 younger men hauled in a new shipment. A crate of puppies, no older than 6 weeks. David clenched his fists. They needed to act fast. The plan goes wrong. David took a slow breath, pulling his phone from his pocket. He had already tried calling the local police department, but the answer had been the same every time. No jurisdiction, no resources, not our problem. It was bullshit, of course. Trevor had connections, and Hollow Creek's law enforcement had long since learned to look the other way, which meant David had no backup. Sarah glanced at him. "What's the plan?" David met her eyes. "We get those dogs out." Sarah gave a small, sharp nod. "Then we'd better move." They crept toward the warehouse's side door, a rusted metal entrance that was barely hanging on its hinges. David carefully tested the handle. Unlocked. He pushed it open just enough for them to slip inside. The stench was overwhelming. Urine, sweat, and something worse. The dogs closest to the door whimpered, sensing movement. Sarah immediately moved toward them, whispering softly as she checked the locks on the cages. David pressed forward, keeping low. He needed a weapon. His eyes landed on a crowbar leaning against a stack of crates. He grabbed it just as the first voice rang out. "Hey, who the hell are you?" David spun just as one of Trevor's men rushed toward him. A young guy, maybe mid-20s, built like a linebacker, but too slow. David stepped sideways and swung the crowbar, catching him in the ribs. The man stumbled, gasping. But before David could react, another set of hands grabbed him from behind. A sharp punch to the gut knocked the wind out of him. David gritted his teeth, twisting free just in time to see Trevor stepping forward, a knife glinting in his hand. "Well, well," Trevor said, his voice amused. "I thought I told you to mind your own damn business, Monroe." David steadied himself, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "Funny. I was just about to say the same thing to you." Trevor chuckled. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" David didn't answer. His eyes flicked to Sarah, who was still working on the cages, her hands moving quickly. She needed more time. Trevor must have noticed. His smirk faded. "You think you're saving them? You think this stops anything?" He gestured at the warehouse. "For every dog you take, I bring in 20 more." David tightened his grip on the crowbar. Not after tonight. Trevor's eyes darkened. He lunged forward. David barely dodged in time, the knife slashing across his arm, tearing through fabric and grazing skin. Pain flared, but he didn't slow. He swung the crowbar, aiming for Trevor's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground. Trevor stumbled back, his face twisting in rage. Before he could react, David tackled him, hard, slamming him into the nearest cage. The dogs inside barked wildly, sensing the chaos. Trevor fought back, landing a solid punch to David's jaw. He tasted blood, but he didn't stop. He drove his knee into Trevor's stomach, then threw him to the ground. Trevor groaned, coughing. "You don't know what you're doing." David wiped blood from his mouth. "Yeah, I do." Then the cops arrived. Aftermath. The flashing red and blue lights painted the warehouse in streaks of color. Officers swarmed the scene, securing the area, while animal control units moved in. Sarah stood beside David, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, but her eyes shining with victory. "We did it," she murmured. David exhaled, watching as Trevor Lane was finally dragged away in cuffs. He had made a mistake coming back to Hollow Creek, and David had made sure it was his last one. The smell of burnt rubber and damp earth clung to the air as the last of the police vehicles pulled away from the warehouse. The flashing red and blue lights that had illuminated the night for the past hour had finally dimmed, leaving only the soft hum of engines and the distant barking of rescued dogs in their wake. David stood just outside the wreckage of what had once been Trevor Lane's underground operation, his knuckles still aching from the fight. His ribs protested with every breath, but the pain didn't matter, not now. Sarah was beside him, arms crossed, her sharp green eyes scanning the scene. Sweat and dirt streaked her face, but she barely seemed to notice. "Animal control says they're taking the rescued dogs to the shelter downtown," she said. "Most of them are dehydrated, some injured, but they'll be okay." David nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He turned toward the mother dog, lying a few feet away under a dim pool of light. Her golden fur was matted with blood, her body still and weak. She had collapsed after throwing herself in front of him, taking the brunt of an attack meant for him. He knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her flank. She was still breathing, but barely. Sarah crouched down, placing a hand on his shoulder. "David!" "I know," he murmured, his voice rough. The mother dog had saved his life, and now she was slipping away. She opened her eyes just barely, as if recognizing him. Despite the pain, there was no fear in her gaze, just quiet understanding. David swallowed hard. "You did good," he whispered, running a hand gently over her head. "You saved them all." Her body shuddered with one last breath. Then she was still. Sarah exhaled sharply beside him. "Damn it," she muttered, swiping at her eyes before standing up. David remained where he was, his hands still resting on the mother dog's motionless body. His jaw clenched, grief tightening his chest. She had survived so much. The abuse, the cold, the hunger. She had fought for her pups, protected them against the worst of humanity. And now, in her final act, she had chosen to protect him too. A soft whimper pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see the 5 puppies huddled together a few feet away. They were still small, fragile, their fur damp from the night's chaos. They didn't understand what had happened, but they knew something was wrong. One of them, slightly bigger than the rest, took a shaky step forward, sniffing at its mother. When she didn't move, it let out a small, heartbreaking cry. David felt his chest tighten. Sarah sighed. "They're too young to be without her," she said. "They'll need bottle feeding, round-the-clock care. It's a lot of work." David looked at the pups again, their tiny bodies trembling in the cold night air. They were alone now, just like he had been, once. He made his decision in that moment. "I'll take them," he said. Sarah blinked. "All of them?" David nodded. "She died saving me. The least I can do is make sure her pups have a chance." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "You'll need formula. I have some back at the clinic." David barely heard her. He was already gathering the puppies, bundling them carefully in his arms. They squirmed slightly but didn't resist, as if they already knew they were safe with him. A new beginning. 2 days later, David stood on the front porch of his house, a cup of coffee in one hand and a sleepy golden-furred puppy curled up in the crook of his arm. The others were inside, tucked into a makeshift bed in his living room, their tiny bodies rising and falling with slow, peaceful breaths. They were settling in. So was he. A car pulled into the driveway. Ethan Carter stepped out, balancing on crutches. His face was still pale from his time in the hospital, but his blue eyes lit up when he saw David. "You really kept them," Ethan said as he made his way up the steps. David nodded, giving the pup in his arms a gentle scratch behind the ears. Yeah, they needed a home. Ethan swallowed, his gaze drifting toward the doorway. "I wish Daisy was here," he murmured. David felt a pang in his chest. "She saved a lot of lives," he said softly, "including mine." Ethan nodded, blinking quickly as he looked down. Then he smiled just a little. "Can I meet them?" David stepped aside, opening the door. "Come on in, kid." Inside, the puppies stirred at the sound of voices. As Ethan lowered himself onto the couch, the pups sniffed at him curiously, tails wagging. A laugh escaped him, a real one, full of warmth. David leaned against the wall, watching. Daisy was gone. But in the end, her sacrifice had given these little ones a second chance. And somehow, in saving them, David had found something worth holding on to, too. Sometimes, the greatest acts of love come not in words, but in sacrifice. Daisy, the mother dog, had nothing left to give but her own life, and yet she gave it willingly, to protect, to save, to ensure that her pups had a future. And in that moment, she became a reflection of something greater, something divine. This story reminds us of the unseen miracles that happen every day, often in the smallest acts of kindness. God works through all his creations, through the loyalty of a dog, through the courage of a man who refused to turn away, through a boy who never stopped believing in his lost friend. In a world that can be dark, cruel, and filled with loss, there is still light. There is still hope. And just like Daisy's sacrifice gave her puppies a second chance, we too are called to be vessels of love and protection for those who cannot defend themselves. Whether it's through rescuing an animal, helping a stranger, or simply choosing compassion over indifference, we can be part of God's miracles. Let this story be a reminder that love, even when it costs us, is never wasted. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and fill your life with the same kind of love and devotion that Daisy showed for her family. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below, let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story of love, hope, and faith. Because in the end, the world needs more stories like this, and it needs more people like you. For years, he was nothing more than a shadow behind rusted bars, chained, forgotten, left to waste away while the world moved on. No one stopped. No one cared. Until one girl did. When Emily locked eyes with him, she saw more than just a neglected dog. She saw a soul crying for freedom. But could she save him before it was too late? What happens next will break your heart and restore your faith in kindness. The town of Millbrook was a place where life moved forward in quiet repetition. The morning streets bustled with tired workers shuffling toward their daily grind, and in the evenings, porch lights flickered on as families settled in for the night. It was the kind of town where people greeted each other with polite nods, but rarely pried into the lives of their neighbors. There were stories hidden in the cracks of the sidewalks, behind old doors, and within rusted fences, but few ever cared enough to look closer. One such place stood at the far edge of town, past the last stretch of tidy homes and carefully mowed lawns, a house that time had long since abandoned. Its wooden panels were cracked and weather-worn, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the front porch leaned as if exhausted from years of neglect. The chain-link fence that surrounded the property was rusted, its gate barely hanging onto its hinges, swaying in the wind with a creaking groan. And behind that fence, tethered to an old iron post, was Bruno. Bruno had once been a magnificent dog, a purebred Rottweiler with a body built for strength and loyalty. His broad chest and muscular frame had once been the pride of his breed, his coat sleek and black, his rust-colored markings bold against the dark fur. But time and cruelty had worn him down. His ribs jutted out from beneath a coat that had grown patchy and dull. His once powerful legs trembled when he stood, too weak from malnutrition and lack of movement. The heavy chain around his neck had rusted with time, its links pressing into the matted fur, leaving raw patches where it had rubbed against his skin for years. He rarely barked anymore. There was no point. Bruno had long since learned that no one listened. His owner, Harris, was a man whose presence was as worn down as his home. He had once been something more, someone more. In his younger years, he had been strong, disciplined, a soldier who had served with honor. But time had stripped that away. The war had taken his youth, loss had stolen his spirit, and bitterness had filled the space they left behind. His wife had been the last thread holding him to the world, but when she passed, something inside him withered. His son, unable to bear the weight of a father who had become more ghost than man, left home and never returned. The isolation became routine, the house fell into disrepair, and Bruno, once a gift from his son, became nothing more than another thing left behind, a living relic of a life Harris no longer cared for. People in town whispered about the old man in the house at the edge of Millbrook. Some said he had gone crazy. Others said he was just mean. No one truly knew, and no one cared. The few who noticed Bruno had long since written him off as well. The neighborhood children saw him as little more than a curiosity, occasionally stopping by to throw pebbles at him through the fence, testing to see if he'd react. But Bruno had stopped reacting long ago. The world had given up on him. And then, one day, Emily walked by. Emily Carter was the kind of person who couldn't turn away from suffering. Maybe that was because she had known it too well herself. She was 20 years old, a college student studying veterinary science, a decision fueled by a childhood spent patching up stray cats and injured birds. She had always been the girl who brought home the broken things, much to the exhaustion of her father, who had never truly understood why she cared so much. Her father, Richard Carter, was a man of few words. Once he had been warm, full of laughter, a man whose presence filled a room. But when Emily's mother was diagnosed with cancer, something in him changed. The sickness dragged on for years, and when her mother finally passed, he became distant, lost in grief that never fully faded. He still provided, still made sure Emily had everything she needed, but the warmth was gone. She had learned to care for herself, to navigate the silences that filled their house, and to seek comfort in the companionship of animals rather than people. That afternoon, Emily had been walking home from the bus stop, her backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds in, lost in the familiar rhythm of her playlist. It was late autumn, and the wind carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, swirling them around her feet as she walked. She had passed this street countless times, her mind always elsewhere, never bothering to glance beyond the rusted fence that loomed on the corner. But today, something made her look. At first, she wasn't sure what had drawn her attention. Maybe it was the way the wind rattled the gate, the eerie creak that sent a shiver down her spine. Maybe it was the way the setting sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard. Or maybe it was him, Bruno. At first, he seemed like nothing more than another forgotten thing in the yard, a mound of fur barely distinguishable from the dirt beneath him. He lay stretched out on his side, motionless, his ribs pressing against his skin like fragile branches. For a brief moment, she thought he was dead. But then he moved. It was small, just the slow lift of his head, the flicker of his dull brown eyes beneath heavy lids. And then their gazes met. Emily stopped walking. She had seen sad eyes before. She had seen the vacant, hollow stares of animals who had been hurt, abandoned, cast aside. But there was something different in Bruno's gaze. It wasn't just sadness. It was the kind of hopelessness that settled deep into the bones, the kind that came from knowing that this existence, was all there would ever be. Emily's grip tightened around the strap of her backpack. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time, in what felt like years, Bruno saw someone, and for the first time, someone saw him. Emily walked home that evening, but her thoughts remained chained to the rusted fence on the edge of town. She couldn't shake the image of Bruno, the dullness in his eyes, the way his ribs pressed against his skin, the sheer weight of neglect that clung to him like an invisible shroud. It made her stomach churn with unease, anger mixing with sorrow in a way that left her restless long after she got home. Her house was modest, nestled between two larger homes with manicured lawns. The porch light flickered on as she approached, illuminating the cracked pavement leading to the front steps. The air smelled faintly of her father's usual dinner, something frozen and reheated, a sign of his growing disinterest in the simple routines of life. Richard Carter sat at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper with his usual silence. He was a man who had once been broad-shouldered and confident, but grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a quieter, thinner version of himself. His hair, once a deep chestnut like Emily's, was now peppered with gray, and lines of exhaustion had settled into his features. He still carried himself with the posture of a man who had once been active, but there was an undeniable tiredness in his movements. Emily hesitated before speaking. "Dad, do you know anything about the old man who lives on the edge of town? The one with the dog?" Richard glanced up, his brow furrowing. "Harris?" His voice was rough from years of disuse, as if he had forgotten how to fill a room with conversation. Emily nodded. Her father set down the newspaper, sighing as he leaned back in his chair. "I don't know much. Used to be in the military. Came back different. Lost his wife not long after. His son left town years ago. Never looked back. No one really talks to him." Emily absorbed this information, biting her lip. "And the dog?" Richard shrugged. "Had him for years. People say he was a gift from his son before he left. Guess he stopped caring about it like he stopped caring about everything else." Emily's hands clenched into fists. She had seen neglect before. She had worked at shelters, had seen the way animals were tossed aside when they became inconvenient. But this felt worse. This was slow cruelty, the kind that was easy to overlook because it wasn't loud or obvious. She knew she couldn't ignore it. The next morning she took a different route to campus, making sure to pass by Harris's house. Bruno was still there, motionless in the dirt, his chain barely giving him enough slack to shift positions. The sight sent a pang of frustration through her, but she knew storming onto the property and demanding his release wouldn't work. She needed a plan. Later that day, she stopped by the local grocery store, hoping to find someone who might know more about Harris. The store was small, the kind where everyone recognized each other, the aisles stocked with just enough variety to keep people from needing to drive to the next town. The cashier was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her name tag read, Linda Perkins. She was the type of woman who knew everything about everyone and made no effort to hide it. Her blonde hair was cropped short, practical, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years managing both a store and the gossip that came with it. Emily approached the counter cautiously. "Hey, do you know much about Harris?" Linda arched an eyebrow. "Old man Harris? Why? He finally scares someone off with that glare of his?" Emily forced a small smile. "I saw his dog. He's in really bad shape." Linda exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "That poor thing. Been there as long as I can remember. People have tried to talk to Harris about it before, but he's stubborn as a mule, won't listen to nobody." Emily leaned forward. "Has anyone ever tried taking the dog?" Linda gave her a pointed look. "You think that'd go unnoticed? Harris may be half out of touch, but he's not blind. That dog's still there because nobody's been able to do a thing about it." Emily nodded slowly. "So he's just, stuck?" Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Unless you convince Harris to let him go, yeah, stuck." That answer wasn't good enough. Emily spent the next few days trying to figure out a way to approach Harris. She watched his house from a distance, observing his routine. He rarely left, only stepping outside to toss scraps to Bruno or to sit on his porch, staring at nothing. On Friday afternoon, after her last class, she made her move. She walked up to the rusted fence, gripping the bars lightly. Bruno barely lifted his head, but his eyes flickered in recognition. Then, the front door creaked open. Harris stood in the doorway, his presence as weathered as the house behind him. Up close, he looked even older than Emily had expected, his face lined with years of hardship, his gray beard unkempt. He had the posture of a man who had once stood tall but had since been weighed down by time. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto her with suspicion. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, the kind that had been left unused for too long. Emily didn't waver. "I want to talk about your dog," Harris snorted. "He's fine." "He's not," she countered, her voice firm. "He's starving. He can barely move. He needs help." Harris's expression didn't change. Ain't your business. Emily stepped closer, gripping the fence tighter. It is now. A long silence stretched between them. Then Harris exhaled, shaking his head. That dog's old, useless, ain't no saving him. Emily's jaw clenched. He's not useless. Harris scoffed, turning back toward the house. Go home, girl. Emily didn't move. She watched as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a finality that made it clear. He had no intention of listening. But Emily wasn't giving up. Not yet. Emily wasn't one to give up easily. Harris had slammed the door on her, but that only strengthened her resolve. She knew Bruno couldn't survive much longer under these conditions. If she couldn't convince Harris to let him go, she had to find another way. So she did the only thing she could. She started showing up. Every morning before class and every evening after, Emily made her way to the rusted fence at the edge of town. She brought food, real food, not the scraps Bruno had been surviving on, freshly cooked chicken, kibble soaked in warm broth, anything that would be gentle on his weakened stomach. She filled a small plastic bowl with clean water and pushed it through the gaps in the fence. At first, Bruno barely reacted, too weak to do more than lift his head and sniff at the offerings. But after a few days, something in him changed. The first time he took a bite in her presence, Emily nearly cried. Bruno was still cautious, his movements slow and stiff, but the more she came, the more he seemed to trust her. He no longer flinched when she reached toward him through the fence. He started lifting his head when he heard her approach. His tail, thin and barely moving at first, gave the slightest wag one evening. It wasn't just about the food. She stayed. She sat on the sidewalk outside the fence, her back against the cold metal, and talked to him. About school, about her mother, about the quiet sadness that sometimes filled her house. Bruno listened in the way only animals could, his deep brown eyes watching her with something that looked like understanding. But Emily wasn't the only one who noticed. One evening, as she sat beside the fence, feeding Bruno small bites of boiled chicken, the porch creaked. The sound was sharp in the quiet, and when she looked up, Harris was standing there. The old man wasn't wearing his usual scowl. He simply watched her, arms crossed, a cigarette dangling loosely from his fingers. His clothes were the same ones he always wore, faded jeans, a flannel shirt that had once been red but had since faded into something closer to rust. He was thinner than she had realized, his frame gaunt beneath the layers. The lines on his face were deep, his skin rough like old leather. You always talk to dogs like that? His voice was dry, but there was no real bite to it. Emily didn't flinch. Only the ones who listen. Harris huffed a laugh, but it was bitter, humorless. He took a drag of his cigarette, the ember flaring briefly in the dim light. You think feeding him's gonna change anything? I think he deserves more than what you've been giving him, Emily shot back. Harris didn't argue. He just exhaled smoke and shook his head. You don't know a damn thing, girl. Then tell me, she said, standing. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and went back inside. Emily stayed until Bruno finished his food before leaving. The next night, it rained. It wasn't a soft drizzle, but a relentless downpour, cold and biting, soaking the streets and turning the dirt around the fence into thick mud. Most people would have stayed home, curled up inside with a warm drink. But Emily couldn't. She knew Bruno had no shelter. By the time she reached the house, her clothes were drenched, her sneakers squelching with every step. She found Bruno curled into himself, shivering, his fur matted against his thin frame. Without thinking, she pulled off her jacket and draped it over him, crouching beside him, shielding him from the worst of the rain. You're okay, she murmured, stroking his damp fur. I've got you. The porch light flicked on. Emily turned just as the front door creaked open. Harris stood in the doorway, staring at her. For the first time, his expression wasn't one of annoyance or anger. It was something else, something tired, something broken. You're gonna catch your death out there, he muttered. Emily didn't move. So will he. Harris exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. Then, to her utter shock, he stepped out onto the porch, rain soaking into his shirt within seconds. He moved stiffly, his joints creaking with the effort, and for the first time, he walked to the fence. He looked down at Bruno. The dog lifted his head slightly, blinking up at him. There was no fear in his eyes, no resentment, just quiet, unwavering loyalty. Harris swore under his breath and turned away. But he didn't go inside. Instead, he lowered himself onto the porch steps, staring out at the rain. Emily didn't push him. She just sat with Bruno, waiting. Minutes passed before he finally spoke. "She died young," he said. His voice was rough, heavy with something deeper than time. Emily knew who he meant before he said it. "My wife. She got sick while I was overseas. By the time they let me come back, it was too late. She was gone." His hands trembled slightly as he lit another cigarette. "My son, he blamed me. Said if I hadn't left, maybe she wouldn't have given up." Emily swallowed. Harris continued, his voice hollow. "He was 17. Packed his things and walked out the door. Never saw him again." Emily had always assumed Harris had been cruel his whole life, but this was grief. Bruno stirred beside her, pressing his nose against the fence. Harris looked at him, his expression unreadable. "He gave me that damn dog before he left," he muttered. "Said maybe I'd take better care of him than I did of our family." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Harris sighed, running a hand down his face. "I ain't got much left," he admitted. "Some days I don't even know why I bother getting up." Emily knew that feeling all too well. "You still have him?" she said quietly, nodding toward Bruno. Harris looked at the dog again, his jaw tightening. Then, without another word, he pushed himself up, joints creaking, and stepped back toward the house. He hesitated in the doorway before glancing over his shoulder. "You'll be back tomorrow?" Emily met his gaze, unwavering. "Yes." He gave a small nod. Then, for the first time, he left the door open behind him. It wasn't permission, but it wasn't a refusal either. Emily had cracked the door open, but she knew she hadn't yet stepped inside. Harris wasn't the type of man to change overnight. Years of loss and isolation had hardened him into someone who didn't trust easily, someone who held on to what little he had left, no matter how broken it was. But for the first time, there was a sliver of hope. Bruno's condition haunted her. Even though he was eating more regularly now, his body had endured too much neglect. His movements were stiff, slow, as if every step sent pain shooting through his joints. His fur, despite the food and care, remained thin in places where the chain had rubbed raw spots into his skin. He was trying. She could see it in the way he lifted his head a little faster when she arrived, the way his tail occasionally gave a weak wag. But trying wasn't enough. He needed medical care. She had to do something. One afternoon after class, Emily walked into Millbrook Animal Rescue, a small shelter on the outskirts of town. The scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint, familiar smell of dogs filled the air. The walls were lined with kennels, soft whimpers, and curious eyes peering through the metal bars. Behind the front desk stood Dr. Rebecca Nolan, the town's only veterinarian and the woman who ran the shelter. She was in her late 40s, tall and lean, with a streak of gray cutting through her otherwise dark brown hair. Her hands were strong but gentle, the kind that had spent years handling fragile lives. She had an air of quiet authority, the kind that made people listen when she spoke. Emily had met her a few times before, when volunteering at the shelter over the summer. Rebecca glanced up from a clipboard and gave a small smile. "Emily Carter. Haven't seen you around lately. What brings you in?" Emily took a deep breath. "I need help." Rebecca set down the clipboard. "With what?" Emily hesitated before launching into the story. Bruno, the rusted chain, Harris, the neglect that wasn't intentional but was still killing the dog slowly. She spoke quickly, afraid that if she didn't get it all out at once, she might lose her nerve. When she finished, Rebecca sighed and leaned against the counter. "I know about Harris. Most of the town does." Emily frowned. "Then why hasn't anyone done anything?" Rebecca gave her a pointed look. "Because he's not the type of man you can force." Emily clenched her fists. "That dog doesn't have time to wait for him to change." Rebecca studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You're right." She grabbed a folder from beneath the counter and flipped through a few papers. "Legally, there's not much we can do unless there's clear abuse. Neglect is tricky. He's feeding the dog, even if it's barely enough. The best thing we can do is convince him to surrender Bruno willingly." Emily's shoulders slumped. "He's not going to do that." Rebecca smirked. "Not yet. But he let you feed him. That's a start." Emily exhaled sharply. "So, what do we do?" Rebecca tapped the folder. "If we can get him to agree to a vet checkup, That's something. If we can document Bruno's condition, we might have more leverage. Emily nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a plan. That evening she returned to Harris's house, her backpack filled with Bruno's usual food, and an idea she wasn't sure would work. Harris was already outside, seated on the porch steps, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. He watched as she approached, but he didn't say anything. Emily crouched beside Bruno, letting him eat before speaking. "I talked to a vet today." Harris grunted. "That right?" "She wants to check on Bruno, make sure he's okay." Harris took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaling through his nose. "Ain't got money for that." Emily shook her head. "She'll do it for free." Silence stretched between them. Harris's gaze flickered toward Bruno, who was chewing his food slowly, his jaw moving with effort. For all his gruffness, Emily knew Harris wasn't blind. He could see it too, the way Bruno struggled, the way his body had thinned to something fragile. Finally, Harris sighed. "Fine." Emily blinked. "Fine?" He scowled. "Don't make me say it again." The next morning, Emily and Rebecca arrived at Harris's house. Rebecca had brought her medical bag, and her sharp eyes took in Bruno's condition with the efficiency of someone who had seen too many cases like his before. She crouched beside him, her touch firm but careful as she ran her hands over his bony frame. "He's severely underweight," she muttered, mostly to herself. "Muscle loss is bad, and his joints are stiff, probably arthritis from being confined so long." She lifted one of his paws, gently pressing along the tendons. Bruno didn't resist, too weak to protest. His fur's in bad shape. Could be a mix of malnutrition and possible infections where the chain's been digging in. Harris stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching in silence. Rebecca sat back on her heels. "He needs treatment, proper food, medication for his joints, and that chain needs to come off permanently." Harris's jaw tightened. "You saying I ain't taking care of him?" Rebecca didn't flinch. "I'm saying he won't last much longer if something doesn't change." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken truths settling between them. Harris's fingers twitched at his side, but he said nothing. Emily took a slow breath. "We can help, but you have to let us." For a long moment, Harris didn't move. Then, with a slow, reluctant nod, he turned and disappeared into the house. When he returned, he had a set of bolt cutters in his hands. He walked to the fence, eyes unreadable, and without a word, he snapped the lock holding Bruno's chain in place. The metal clattered to the ground. Bruno flinched at the sound, his body stiff. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he took a step forward, unrestrained for the first time in years. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Harris turned away. "Do what you gotta do," he muttered. Then, without another word, he walked back inside. Emily exhaled, looking at Rebecca. Rebecca gave her a small smile. "Well, that's a start." And for the first time, Emily believed it. The night was cold, colder than it should have been for early autumn. A bitter wind howled through the quiet town of Millbrook, rustling leaves and rattling windows. The streets were empty. The town already asleep, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light or the faint glow of a television behind drawn curtains. At the far edge of town, Harris sat alone on his porch, staring into the darkness. The cigarette between his fingers had long since burned out, but he hadn't moved to replace it. He had barely spoken a word since the vet's visit earlier that day. Bruno lay near the steps, his massive frame curled up against the cold earth. The chain was gone now, and though his legs were still weak, he had begun to move a little more freely. He was no longer bound to one spot, yet he hadn't left. Despite everything, he stayed close to the man who had ignored him for years. Harris let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent the last few days trying to come to terms with something he had never expected. Change. He didn't like change. For years, his life had remained the same, a dull, aching repetition of loneliness. No one asked about him. No one cared. And he had been fine with that. Or at least, he had convinced himself he was. But then Emily had appeared, stubborn and unrelenting, forcing him to see the truth in front of him. Bruno wasn't just some dog wasting away in his yard. He was a soul that had been waiting. Harris sighed, glancing at the dog. "Should have let her take you," he muttered, voice hoarse. "Probably would have been better off." Bruno didn't move. He only lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes reflecting something Harris couldn't quite place. Then, somewhere in the house, a sound. It was faint at first, a creak, a shifting of old wood. Harris frowned, turning his head. And then he smelled it. Smoke. His body tensed, the memory of years in the military kicking in like a reflex. He stood abruptly, scanning the house. Then he saw it. A faint orange glow from one of the back windows, flickering like an ember growing into something dangerous. Fire. Harris cursed under his breath, moving quickly toward the door. He shoved it open, coughing as smoke billowed toward him. The old house was dry, filled with aged wood and dust that caught flame too easily. The kitchen was already engulfed, the flames licking hungrily at the ceiling, crawling along the walls. He took a step back, his mind racing. He needed water. No, he needed to get out. But before he could turn, a loud crack echoed through the house. The ceiling above the hallway groaned, and before he could react, a beam collapsed. Harris barely had time to stumble back before the weight of it crashed down, blocking the exit. The flames surged, heat pressing against his skin, thick smoke stealing the air from his lungs. He was trapped. His heart pounded. His legs felt heavy. He had faced worse: war, grief, loneliness. But none of those things had prepared him for the choking, blinding fear of this moment. Then, through the roar of the fire, he heard it. A bark. Not a weak, pitiful sound, but a deep, commanding bark, one filled with urgency, determination. Bruno. The dog was outside, but his voice cut through the smoke, sharp and insistent. Another bark followed, louder this time, and then, crashing. Harris squinted through the thick haze, eyes watering. A dark shape barreled through the broken back door, moving low and fast. Bruno. The dog's movements were not graceful. His body was still weak, his legs not as strong as they should have been. But he moved. He wove through the fallen debris, ears flattened against his head, his focus solely on Harris. Harris tried to step forward, but his legs buckled. He coughed violently, the smoke clawing at his throat, his vision going hazy. His body refused to cooperate. Bruno reached him, nudging his arm with his nose, whining low in his throat. The dog's body trembled, but he refused to leave him. With effort, Harris managed to lift his arm, resting his hand on Bruno's back. He barely had the strength to stand, but Bruno did. The dog growled softly, then took a step forward. He wasn't dragging him, not entirely, but he was guiding him, step by step, forcing him to move. The flames crackled around them, the air suffocating. The house groaned under its own weight, but Bruno kept going. They stumbled through the wreckage, weaving past burning furniture, avoiding the worst of the flames. Harris's grip on Bruno was weak, but the dog pressed into him, refusing to let him fall. Then, air. Fresh, cold air. They burst through the ruined doorway, collapsing onto the dirt outside. Harris gasped, coughing violently, his lungs burning as he sucked in the crisp night air. His skin was blistered, his clothes singed, but he was alive. Bruno lay beside him, panting hard, his body heaving with exhaustion. His fur was darkened with soot, his eyes half-lidded with fatigue, but there was something in them that made Harris's throat tighten. Loyalty. The dog that he had ignored, neglected, forgotten, had just saved his life. The distant sound of sirens echoed through the night. A faint, panicked voice called his name. Emily. She had seen the fire from down the street. She had been running. By the time she reached them, her face was pale with fear. "Oh my God! Harris!" She fell to her knees beside them, her hands hovering as if unsure who to check first. Harris barely had the strength to lift his head. His voice was hoarse, weak. "Bruno!" Emily turned to the dog, her breath hitching when she saw him. Bruno had collapsed completely now, his body still, chest rising and falling in slow, ragged breaths. Emily's hands trembled. "We need to get him help." Harris swallowed hard. He felt something foreign, something unfamiliar, settle deep in his chest. Guilt. Regret. Love. His fingers twitched, reaching out, brushing against Bruno's paw. The dog's eyes flickered open, just for a second, as if he was making sure Harris was still there. Harris let out a slow, shaking breath. "Take him," he rasped. Emily's eyes widened. "What?" Harris swallowed hard. "Take him," he repeated, voice softer now. "He deserves better." Emily hesitated as if waiting for him to take it back. But when he didn't, she gave a small, shaky nod. "I'll take care of him," she whispered. Harris exhaled, closing his eyes. "For as long as he has left," he murmured. Emily reached down, running a gentle hand over Bruno's head. "I promise." The first night Bruno spent at Emily's house was quiet. Too quiet. He lay on a soft dog bed in the corner of the living room, his large body curled into itself. Emily had bought the bed earlier that day, along with new bowls, toys, and food, everything he needed to feel at home. But Bruno didn't seem to understand that yet. He barely moved, only lifting his head now and then to glance around as if unsure of where he was. Emily watched him from the couch, her heart aching. She had expected some hesitation, but seeing him like this, uncertain, lost, reminded her just how much time he had spent in that yard, chained and forgotten. Her father, Richard, sat across from her, his arms crossed as he observed the dog in silence. It had been years since they had a pet in the house, not since her mother passed. Richard had always been a quiet man, but grief had deepened that silence. He still went through the motions, went to work, paid the bills, kept the house running, but he rarely engaged in anything beyond the bare necessities of life. Emily had learned to stop expecting him to fill the spaces left behind. But now, for the first time in a long while, there was something new in their home. "He's big," Richard finally said, his voice gruff. Emily smiled faintly. "Yeah." Richard leaned forward, studying the dog. "And old." She nodded. "Yeah." A long pause, then, softer, "He gonna be okay?" Emily glanced at Bruno, her heart tightening. "I hope so." The next morning, she woke early and found Bruno still lying in the same position, his breathing slow and steady. She crouched beside him, running a gentle hand over his back. His fur was softer now, clean from the bath she had given him the night before, though scars still marred his skin where the chain had rubbed raw. "Come on, buddy," she murmured. "Let's go outside." She clipped a leash onto the collar Dr. Rebecca had given him. He didn't resist, but he didn't move either. He just looked at her with tired, uncertain eyes. Emily swallowed hard. He doesn't know he's free. Gently, she tugged the leash, coaxing him toward the door. It took a few hesitant steps, but finally, he followed. Outside, the morning air was crisp, the grass damp with dew. Their backyard wasn't large, but it was enough. A patch of green where Bruno could finally walk without chains. Emily unclipped the leash and stepped back. Bruno didn't move. He stood in place, staring at the open space before him. His ears twitched, his nose lifting slightly as if testing the air. And then slowly, he took a step forward. Then another. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he ran. It wasn't graceful. His legs were still weak, his body not used to movement. But he ran. Across the yard, his tail wagging for the first time, his paws sinking into the damp earth. Emily felt something sting behind her eyes as she watched. For the first time in years, Bruno was free. Across town, Harris sat alone in what was left of his house. The fire had destroyed much of the back rooms, leaving the place barely livable. The insurance company had sent an inspector earlier that morning, and the news wasn't good. The house was old, unstable. Repairing it would cost more than it was worth. He had nowhere to go. The thought should have bothered him more than it did. But the truth was, he already felt like he had nothing left. The silence in the house was unbearable. For years, he had barely spoken to Bruno, had barely even acknowledged him. But now that the dog was gone, the absence was deafening. No quiet breathing, no heavy sighs, no dull eyes staring at him from across the yard. Just nothing. He hadn't realized how much he had gotten used to not being alone until now. With a heavy sigh, Harris reached for the old wooden box he kept on the table. It was worn from age, the corners splintering, but he never had the heart to throw it out. Inside were old photographs. He pulled one out, a faded picture of a young man standing beside a puppy. His son, grinning, holding up a tiny Rottweiler with oversized paws. Bruno. Harris exhaled shakily. He had forgotten this picture even existed. He had forgotten a lot of things. Back at Emily's house, Bruno had tired himself out. He lay stretched out in the backyard, his chest rising and falling with deep, contented breaths. Emily sat beside him, her fingers idly stroking his fur. "You did good today," she whispered. Bruno didn't respond, but his tail gave a weak thump against the ground. She smiled. For the first time since she had found him behind that rusted fence, he looked happy. The wind carried the scent of autumn through the town of Millbrook, rustling the golden leaves along the quiet streets. The air was crisp, but not yet biting. The kind of day that hinted at the coming of winter without the urgency of its arrival. It was a day of change, though no one quite knew it yet. Harris sat on a worn bench outside the temporary shelter he had been staying in since the fire. His house was gone, and with it, the last remnants of the life he had built. He hadn't fought to stay. Maybe deep down, he had known it was time to let go. He spent most of his days lost in thought, the weight of regret pressing heavier with each passing moment. But today, there was something different. A feeling he couldn't quite name, a stirring in his chest that made him feel unsettled. He hadn't spoken to Emily in a while. She had kept her promise to take care of Bruno, and that had been enough. He didn't expect updates. He didn't expect anything. He had spent years convincing himself that expecting nothing was easier than hoping for something. Then a voice broke through the quiet. "Dad?" Harris stiffened. The voice was deep but familiar, laced with hesitation, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Slowly, Harris turned his head. A man stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. He was in his mid-30s, with dark, unkempt hair and tired eyes that mirrored Harris's own. He wore an old military jacket, one that looked as though it had seen years of wear. There was something about the way he stood, something restrained, as if he was holding back the urge to walk away before he even got an answer. His son, Michael Harris. Harris stared, his throat tightening. It had been 15 years since he had last seen him. The boy who had left had been angry, full of resentment and hurt. The man standing before him was different. Older, weighed down by something that time alone hadn't caused. Michael took a slow step forward. I heard about the fire," he said, his voice careful, measured. I didn't know if you were okay." Harris exhaled slowly, trying to find words that didn't come easily. "I'm still here." Michael nodded, his gaze flickering away. "Yeah." He hesitated, shifting awkwardly. "I should have come sooner." Harris said nothing, because it was true. But then, something unexpected, something that cracked through the years of silence like a chisel against stone. "I'm sorry," Michael murmured. His voice wasn't just regretful, it was genuine. For leaving, for not coming back, for everything. Harris swallowed hard. He had imagined this moment before, late at night in the empty rooms of his house. He had imagined anger, blame, shouting. He had imagined himself pushing his son away the same way his son had pushed him away all those years ago. But now, face to face, all he felt was tired. "I wasn't much of a father," Harris admitted gruffly. "Can't blame you for leaving." Michael looked up sharply. "I didn't leave because I hated you." His jaw tightened. "I left because I thought you hated me." Harris felt something crack inside him. He had spent years thinking Michael had abandoned him, but the truth was, he had let him believe he wasn't worth staying for. Before he could say anything, another voice cut through the air. "Mr. Harris?" Emily. She was standing a few feet away, holding onto a leash, and at the other end of it, Bruno. The old Rottweiler stood beside her, his body still frail, but his spirit unbroken. His fur, once patchy and dull, had regained some of its former luster. His frame, though thin, held more strength than it had in years. He moved slowly, carefully, but his tail wagged, just once, as his eyes locked onto Harris. Michael's breath hitched. His gaze dropped to the dog, his expression shifting from confusion to something deeper, something raw. "Bruno?" Emily glanced between them, her expression soft with understanding. "He still remembers you." Michael took a hesitant step forward. Bruno's ears perked slightly. Then, without warning, he moved. He wasn't fast. His body was too worn for that. But he moved with purpose. He closed the distance between them, his old legs carrying him toward the man he had once known, the boy who had once held him as a puppy. Michael dropped to his knees, reaching out with shaking hands. The moment his fingers brushed against Bruno's fur, his composure cracked. A choked sob escaped him, his head bowing as he buried his face against the dog's neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Bruno licked his cheek, just once, as if telling him there was nothing to forgive. Harris watched, something heavy settling in his chest. For years, he had let silence and regret define him. He had let his own pain fester, pushing away the only family he had left. But here, now, watching his son kneel beside a dog who had never stopped waiting. Maybe it wasn't too late. Emily knelt beside Bruno, scratching gently behind his ears. "He doesn't have forever," she said softly, "but he has now." Harris's throat tightened. He looked at his son, his grown son, a man who had come back, who had chosen to come back, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. He exhaled shakily. "You want to get lunch?" Michael blinked, as if unsure he had heard correctly. Harris shifted uncomfortably. "It's been a long time." A long pause, then slowly Michael nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that." Emily smiled, standing. "Bruno and I will walk with you." Harris let out a gruff chuckle. "He don't walk too fast." Emily smirked. "Neither do you." He snorted but didn't argue. As they made their way down the street, the sun peeked through the autumn leaves, casting golden light along the pavement. Bruno walked beside them, his pace slow but steady, his body no longer weighed down by chains. He was free, and he was home. Life has a way of testing us, of making us believe that certain wounds are too deep to heal, that some bridges have been burned beyond repair. But just like Bruno, who spent years in chains, forgotten and unloved, God never forgets his children. Even in the darkest of times, when hope seems lost, he is working in ways we cannot see. He brings people into our lives at the right moment, guiding us toward healing, toward second chances. Emily didn't just save Bruno, she became an instrument of God's love, showing kindness to a creature the world had abandoned. And in doing so, she helped mend a broken family, reminding Harris and Michael that love, no matter how lost, can always be found again. Bruno's story is a testament to the miracles that surround us every day. Sometimes, they come in the form of an unexpected reunion. Sometimes, in the simple act of kindness from a stranger. And sometimes, they come in the form of an old dog who, despite everything, never gave up on love. Let this be a reminder that no one is beyond redemption, no heart too hardened, no soul too lost for God's grace to reach. If you have someone in your life you've drifted away from, if there is a hurt that lingers between you and another, maybe today is the day to take that first step toward healing. We'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment of grace or an unexpected second chance? Share your story in the comments below. Spread the love. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never lost. May God bless you and your loved ones, bringing peace, healing, and the strength to embrace the miracles waiting in your life. If you believe in the power of love, faith, and second chances, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more heartwarming stories that remind us of the goodness in the world. God bless you all.